Good morning, Paul, and good evening, and welcome to today's session. Glad to have you all here on a Saturday evening. So today's topic is going to be about impact of NIS2 on OT security. Those who have been in the OT cybersecurity or cybersecurity uh, field, we all know the importance of NIS2 and what is NIS2 and so on. Today we'll be having a bit of deep dive. I'm sure 1 hour wouldn't be enough, but we'll try to do our best because there's so many challenges, constraints, misunderstanding, and so much information on the internet that nobody is sure what is happening or what's going to happen, right? But this is not something new. In European Union, there has already been a precedent in terms of a general conformity mark. For cybersecurity products and solutions, this is the first. So let's not wait and get into the presentation. So just the agenda for today, a brief introduction, the session, followed by the expert live chat, then a Q&A session, and a conclusion and closing remarks. So kindly share about OT security professionals to your colleagues, near and dear ones, and people who are interested to know more about OT security. We are available in various channels across the social media. One can able to easily reach out to us and join the community and advance themselves. And some house rules. Kindly ensure that you are in a safe environment. If you're driving, please stop at a safe place for the duration of the webinar. Hope you're aware of your surroundings. The session will be for an hour with 30 minutes of Q&A. Questions will be managed by the MS Teams Q&A. So kindly use the facility. Do not enter any questions into the chat message. So feedback form will be shared at the end of the session, and certificate of participation will also be provided for those who submit the feedback form. All right. So today's topic, impact of NIS2 on OT security. It is given by Paul Veeneman. He is not a stranger to us. He's already been here, given a session a month back, and really glad to have you here, Paul, again. Look forward to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it, John. Thanks. All right.
Over to you, Paul.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully I get the right one. All right. Is this showing on the screen? We have the agenda. Are we able to see this?
Yes, Paul, go ahead.
Okay, good deal. All right. Perfect. Thanks, Puneet. All right. So we'll start off with a agenda here for the presentation. And what I do want to do is make sure that kind of a high level of what we're going to look at. So I'll do a review. As John had said, there's a lot of information out there on the internet for the NIS2 directive. We'll talk briefly about what it is, what it means, and then we'll get into what does that look like more or less in a phased approach for OT professionals, process owners, process operators, and and how we can align ourselves to the NIS2 directive and then find some ground truth using other frameworks. Because as we'll discuss, the NIS2 directive, at least Article 22 or 20, was rather nebulous, and it has just a few short items. So we'll talk about what's an important or essential entity, and then what a phased approach looks like. Personnel training, we'll get into a lot of the other items that you see in terms of asset discovery, definitions, and then the monitoring response and how that leads to incident response, right? Which is also very important in collaborative efforts within folks that you're collaborating with. So, so if we were to take a look at the objectives and purposes of the NIS2 overall. So there's an expanded security requirements, right? So from the initial directive going into NIS2, there's also a mandate of minimum security requirements that you're required to have, and then the clear incident response timelines that we're looking at. From the time of the incident until the remediation, root cause analysis, lessons learned, etc. So there's, and then we'll go through that timeline specifically and what your requirements are and what your obligations are towards the end. And then also we'll talk about, there's penalties and sanctions now, and this is meant uh, to incentivize the adherence to the requirements for NIS2 throughout the EU. And I think it's important to understand that it's not only the immediate individuals or organizations or entities that are providing those services, but in critical infrastructure, but also their subs and subcontractors. So if we're going to take a look at Article 21, which is the cybersecurity risk management measures, and this is it. We've got A through G or J, and this is what we have to go on. And there's not a lot there. The NIS2 directive, certainly for OT security, it doesn't provide us with much to do. It's very high level, as you would expect. And so what we have to do as practitioners, decision makers, and stakeholders is figure out, what does that mean for us, and what does that mean for our process environments or our control systems within the various entities, whether essential or important, that are affected by this. So if we were to distill that down, and if we take the direct language from the NIS2 directive, and if we get very specific, so first and foremost, governance, right? So I have policies and procedures. And a lot of times, as many of you may know, is we're lacking in documentation. It could be lack of documentation on the standard operating procedures within a process environment. It could be our policies as an organization. How are we governing ourselves? And a lot of times I'll tell folks that the policy statements are we shall statements. We shall do this. We shall do that. As an example, we'll get into, risk management. Well, you could have a risk management policy that is basically a tailored guidance or directive within your organization that says how will we be executing risk assessments on a periodic basis, maybe not to exceed annually, and not only for the IT side, but then our OT side. And as a lot of you know, a scope or risk assessment for OT is vastly different than what we would ever have on the IT side. So asset management, access control, and then what I've done in green is I've kind of labeled within the individual items of the directive is how these are matching up. So if we had identity management, that's 21.2J, network security, segmentation, data integrity, 21.2H. So what we've tried to do here on this particular screen is take those individual articles within the article itself, or those subcomponents, and then match those to what are, in a phased approach, what is it that we're going to be looking at, and what are we going to try to accomplish so that we can move forward and get to a level of compliance for our organization, which could either be a direct provider of services, you could be a subcontractor, or maybe you're part of the supply chain, somewhere up or down that supply chain within one of the critical areas that's identified within NIS2. So coverage. So when we're looking at migration from the NIS to the NIS2, expanded scope, as I had said before, the two-tier system. So the double E's and then the important entities, the IE, and requirements, stricter obligations, especially in the risk management measures. And then we're trying to unify standards and get to some common ground or a common vernacular definition of terms within NIS2. So as we're sharing information, so a lot of times we'll have incident response that will have lessons learned, and there'll be information that is shared throughout the EU. And what we want to do is make sure that everyone is looking from a same ledger, or as they sometimes say, singing from the same song sheet, and so that there's so that information can be dispersed uniformly throughout the EU, and for the safeguarding of multiple verticals and industries as we find the responses from incidences and lessons learned. Obviously, the supply chain focus, and as we take a look at incident reporting, we'll talk about what is a significant event, and then what does that mean once an event happens in the first 24 hours, 72 hours, and then again, that consistency. You can see this, the standardization of reporting and information distribution. It's going to be vitally important. And then finally, stronger enforcement, as I said before. So there's going to be, it could be 10 million, up to 10 million euros, or 2% of turnover annually. So these are significant, and they're there to incentivize. They always say it's either a carrot or a stick. Well, this is obviously a stick, and a pretty big stick at that. So it's in everybody's best interest to take a look at that stuff, right, and make sure we're in a correct place. And I think it's also probably worth mentioning as we're looking at this that the NIS2 came into effect January 16, 2023. But one of the most important dates is it just passed us, right? So October 7th, member states must adopt and publish measures to comply, right? So and that's still kind of in flux, right? So there's still a lot of member states that are still working through that, but there was that October 17th date. And then we're speeding towards some of the other milestones coming up that are just around the corner: January 17th, April 17th, and then next year, October 17th, any revisions of the directive itself, right? So when you're taking a look for your own organization, and where you might exist as an entity, the first question you're going to ask: do we provide critical service and essential function to end clients as a key supplier? And could we impact public safety, right? Because a lot of times for OT and in critical infrastructure, we have an impact to the communities that we serve, or the constituents that we serve. So, it could be power to an electrical outlet, drinking water to a community via a faucet, the ability to move goods and services around the EU, or around the nations, or the continent, on commuter rail, freight rail. So people, products, goods, and services. Do you operate in one of the sectors, which we'll get into? We'll talk about the individual sectors and the breakdown between essential and important entities and where they might exist. And does your organization operate outside the EU? And are you providing a portion of the supply chain to critical services? So, as myself in the United States, so in the U.S., having clients that are part of the supply chain or part of manufacturing, let's say, to organizations that are EU, there's a regional distribution that some of those organizations that I represent and that I support have to be aware of, right? Because this is now happening, and there could be a downstream impact. And then also there's some carryover into some other areas. So you can see here not only the NIS2 directives, but you may fall under. So one of them is DORA, or the Digital Operations Resilience Act, which is actually came about almost about the same time as the NIS2, and that is sector specific, where NIS2 is all sectors, or the sectors that they've identified. But you may have some overlapping requirements where even finance and banking are identified as essential or important. You could also have the Digital Operations Resilience Act, or DORA, where a sector-specific financial requirement, and you're going to have to kind of stack those. But we should be able to get to a point where we can serve both, have a program, a phased approach in a program that can serve both objectives, right? So if I'm solving for one, I'm probably going to have some overlap and be able to solve for others. So as we kind of start taking a look at the affected industries, right? So essential versus important, and what does that mean? And we've been able to kind of color code them here on this slide. And we see, as I was talking before, you've got finance at the top, energy, and digital space, finance and banking, and space exploration, water supply. Energy and water supply, I've always felt, are very important. Of those two, probably water is chiefly important within critical infrastructure. Also, public administration and healthcare. So if you operate under these, and what we'll do is we'll kind of dive in and we'll take a look at some of these more specifically. And then on the important entities, and this is different, right? So now we've added some other ones: waste management, manufacturing, postal carriers, so the ability to get information around chemical manufacturing, food production, agriculture, things of that nature. So what does it look like if we take a few of these, and if we take a look at the subcategories? And again, all this information is in the directive itself, and you could take a look at that. But just energy alone: electricity, district heating and cooling, oil, gas, hydrogen, very core critical infrastructure components. And if you have an organization that's operating in one of these spaces or one of these verticals, then you would be considered, or have the possibility to be considered, as part of that essential, as an essential entity. Water supply, right? So that's pretty high level. But now as we drill down into some of those subsections: drinking water, suppliers and distributors of drinking water, and then also wastewater management. So not only clean water facilities in OT, but also wastewater facilities. And you can imagine, in both energy and water, there's a significant amount of either, process control environments, distributed control environments. There's a lot of automation that's taking place. And so we'll take a look at what do we need to do to secure those environments. Transportation, so air, rail, and then over the road. Does your organization participate in any of those verticals as an entity? So, and this could include not only freight, but also commuters. So when we take a look at rail infrastructure, we're not only moving goods and products, but we're also moving people. And of course, the primary concern with any program for OT and ICS is always going to be human safety first and foremost. And then probably one of the more expansive, lesser or important entity categories would be manufacturing. There's a lot of manufacturing that takes place. But if we look at the subcomponents of manufacturing, it's medical devices, electronics, machinery, vehicles. That is a huge swath of manufacturing that's taking place in the European Union, and would now be considered important under the NIS2 directive. And there's probably a lot of supply chain in that manufacturing scope within those subcategories that we need to pay attention to, right? So now let's kind of start taking a look at what does this phased approach mean, right? And how can we get from step 1 to, let's say, step 10, and start working towards a functioning and viable program that we can apply to our organization as a recognized essential or important entity. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is have a preparation and training, right? So preparation, it's taking a look at our own governance. We talked about policies and procedures and what that represents. There's also cybersecurity awareness and training. And that is very different when we're talking about OT and OT process owners and practitioners. And what I've always tried to stress is that there has to be a common vernacular, and we have to be able to work together on the IT and the OT side. And many times, if anyone has seen, some of the presentations, it's always kind of I'm usually, because I come from enterprise infrastructure of over like 27, 28 years, but I've worked in critical infrastructure and OT security for about the last 8. But what I've always tried to do is work on a I or OT for IT, because there's a lot of mature processes on the IT side. And what we want to do is take that knowledge over the last few decades and try to apply that as a structure on the OT side, but understanding and enforcing to IT people that the OT environment is different. And that requires a certain level of training for both OT and IT personnel. Discover and define. So if we don't know what we have, then we really don't know the controls or the technical controls that we're applying, or even if they're effective. And again, within the title of Article 21, it's the cybersecurity risk assessment or risk management measures, right? So how are we applying cybersecurity controls and output as part of the findings and the gaps that we see on the risk assessment? But if we don't know what our assets are, that really is ineffective. It's rather nebulous. And then our implementation and deploy. Once we get to a point where we understand what we have, what the risks are to those assets or those environments, whether physical, logical, or otherwise, then we're able to start taking a look at technical or organizational or procedural controls that we can apply to those environments so that we can safeguard those critical assets, those processes, and the output. So the goods, products, and services and the supply chain operating within these essential and important entities and sectors that are defined by the directive itself. And then finally, it's the monitoring, the response, the incident response or incident handling. And then I would add on to this continuous improvement, where we are going back through our process and on at least an annual basis, we're attempting to make sure that we understand where do we have continuing gaps as the organization evolves, as your entity evolves, and then you're making the incremental changes and augmenting your program as necessary. So, as I had said before at the top, the NIS2 directive is pretty high level. And so this past week, and I was talking to Panit about this morning, is I was wondering, how am I going to get to some sort of truth, right? And so we have an international attendee and constituency here on this call. Thank you very much for attending. And so it seemed we wanted, there is ISO 27001, but that's more IT focused. And so I didn't have to look very far in being a senior member of ISA. It seemed pertinent, and it seemed rather obvious to me that we could use the ISA IEC 62443 standard, something that can be universally accepted internationally. It's a certifying body. It's a series of standards that we can apply. And then what was important is to now walk through within this phased approach and understand where the directives from NIS2, and then how can I map those to the ISA IEC 62443 and allow you, the attendees, in our community to be able to take advantage of that. And then that becomes our foundation and kind of our ground truth for what our program might look like. Now, you can mix and match, right? Especially if you have, if you're a global organization and you have operations in the US as well as the UK, let's say. You might take bits and pieces of NIST, right? So you could have the NIST CSF, you have the NIST 882 for control systems, but you'd also have ISA IEC 62443, and maybe you have requirements within your organization for the ISO 27001 standards as well. I think what you'll find as we go through this, you could stack a lot of the control frameworks, whether it's ISO, ISA, NIST, irregardless. A lot of them are going to overlap in a series of areas. And first and foremost, all of them have some sort of an idea about governance at a high level. So the creation of our standards our policies, our procedures. So in 62443, we understand it be risk management, organizing for security, policies, procedures, and then getting to that control system or management and security, right? So and then the cybersecurity awareness training and hygiene. What is our training program? We can draw on the 4324 training and security awareness, and then also the solution staffing and training, right, under 2-4. So there's a lot of opportunity here to be able to use the ISA IC standards for that. And in security, the personnel security. So as we're looking at the personnel that are going to be the process owners, process operators, and our personnel that are building this program, we want to know that we're going through personnel security. And then finally, the information and document management. If we create a lot of the document and management or the documentation, then is that readily available? There's a lot of times when policies and directives for an organization are created that are very valuable for the organization and its personnel to understand how the company is going to conduct itself, but they're not readily available, or they're not made available in the hiring process, new hire process, and they're not published to an area that all the personnel within the organization can get to. And I think that's very important. So if you go through the effort of creating documentation, make sure that it's available so that people can reference it and they can look at it when they have a question on, is there something that we should be doing from a policy perspective? If we look at discover and define, first and foremost, asset management. We'll drill into this in a second and see what that gets us into. Assets can be people, it can be a process, and it can be a component. And I think here we see in ISA 62443, we have the idea of account and administration. We also have access control, authentication, authorization. Now, you may say, Paul, hold on a second. There's open standards in the common industrial protocols. There's no concept of encryption or authentication. I understand that, but we do have IT systems that are operating in the OT environment, such as Windows or Linux-based SCADA systems. We have engineering workstations. So we do have IT components that do have the concept of authentication and authorization to the system. Your firewall that is going to be protecting not only the IT space, but also isolation, segmentation of protocols and networks within the OT space. And we'll a little later in the presentation, I put together a diagram that kind of shows how all those pieces work together. So those firewall switches, those engineering workstations, those SCADA systems, they have the concept of authorization and access control, and we want to make sure that we have that separated. And then the development and maintenance of the program, and then also identifying if you're part of the supply chain or if you are the entity and you have downstream providers. Has your organization in its discovery gone through and understood what the flow down is and who else is within that supply chain? And do we have a weak link in that supply chain that could represent an impact to our OT environment, right? And so we want to make sure that we understand that. And the beauty of that is ISA 62443 actually has the security program requirements for, let's say, IACS service providers. So if there's a third-party engineering group that is augmenting and supporting, or in some cases, an engineering service provider that is managing, maintaining, and monitoring your industrial control or your process environments for you, then are they aligned to the NIS2 directives and all of the requirements that are there? Because they're playing a very core and impactful part in the uptime and the availability of your critical infrastructure for your vertical and for your entity. So as I said previously, if we don't know what we have, then how are we going to protect anything? And so let's take a look at phase 2 and a little bit more in depth. If we look at the asset management process, and the first thing that we want to do is define and identify our scope, and we want to gather information, right? And this is core to an OT risk assessment. And the first thing we want to take a look at is scope. So, and before we even talk about a PLC, an HMI, or an RTU, What about the facility itself? Do we have risks to the facility? Do we have physical access control? Do we have natural occurrences that we have to be aware of? Uh, can weather impact natural weather occurrences? Can that impact our production? So, a risk assessment within a cyber physical or a process control environment where we're doing things in automation at a it could be a medical or industrial level. Have we done the risk assessment from the ground up and ground like the outside? Do we know what that looks like? There are numerous times where I walk in, and you guys probably know this as well. You walk into a process control environment, you're walking the shop floor, and most of the control panels are unlocked. Why are they unlocked? That's a physical access control. Well, because it's convenience. Because the process engineers or process owners, if they're always going into those control panels, a lot of time they want to keep those open. They don't want to have to check in or check out the access keys. But these are the things that we need to be concerned about. So we're going to collect our asset and our asset information, our inventory. And as we start getting into components, the hardware that goes into our control panels, we're going to start looking at asset names, serial numbers, configurations, firmware revisions, software revisions, and be able to build for ourselves a scope of what we have and to get our arms around it. Once we understand what those components are, we then have to start gauging the criticality. So, what is the critical risk? And there's going to be different levels, but we have to classify that and we have to categorize it so that we can appropriately apply technical, organizational, and procedural controls as we're trying to meet those NIS2 directives or simply ensuring the safeguarding of our environments, whether it's for our uptime, our availability, the reliability of our systems, and then most assuredly and most importantly, the safety of any human counterparts that are operating within those physical process environments as well. And then once we have an idea of that, then we'll take a look at the life cycle management and be able to, over time, continue to stay on top of our vulnerability tracking. And again, a vulnerability can be physical access or logical access. I don't think we need to discuss exposed control systems to the internet, right? Shodan.io has tens of thousands of exposed devices that are shown throughout the globe, control systems, whether you're doing a search on Siemens, Rockwell, Allen Bradley, Schneider, it doesn't matter. For convenience purposes, we seem to think that exposing our control systems to the public internet is a good idea. We all know that is a very terrible idea and has had disastrous effects recently. So we understand that we certainly want to always track our vulnerabilities, physical access, logical access, and we want to apply the appropriate controls, which first and foremost should be isolation, segmentation, and network level. And then finally, documentation and reporting and our ability to maintain that reliability of our process and our operations. And that is going to be part of a core component of foundation to our continuous improvement. Because if we're documenting what we have and we're able to see that, then what we can do is have measurable key performance indicators that over time we can improve against. So now, once we get our arms wrapped around what we have and what we need to do, we can start taking a look at now the cybersecurity. And the cybersecurity is going to be the implementation and deployment of controls that would be valuable to the organization, right? So again, the policies and procedures, because that's going to tell us how we're going to operate, what we're going to do, and in our risk management, because we're always reassessing risk. But now cryptography and encryption. So encryption in transit, encryption at rest. As we had talked before, common industrial protocols don't have the capability of encryption. But if I have something like in water and wastewater, so if I have clean water facilities that are separate and distributed from and disparate in space and within a region from my wastewater facilities, I may have a distributed control system that all feeds to a central SCADA system. Well, am I just going to use open channels and unsecured channels to ensure that I have the control in view of that distributed control system. No, I'm going to encrypt those pathways, probably with site-to-site VPNs or something similar. Could be firewalls. And then in some cases, you could have data diodes, where I am getting information out of a secured environment for process control, depending on the sensitivity and the confidentiality or the safeguarding of that environment. I may use a data diode to get data out unidirectionally and be able to have that information coming in. A lot of times we see that in terms of data to the business, right? So using data diodes and unidirectional communication to get information up to, and we'll talk about the Purdue Enterprise reference architecture in terms of levels, but getting that up to level 4 to the enterprise, but ensuring the safeguarding. So where do I use encryption at rest and in transit? And in network information systems. So as I deploy these systems, how am I doing the acquisition? Where, and a lot of times we don't think about supply chain being procurement for our own entities and our own organizations. Are you, as an OT security and practitioner, working with your procurement department, whoever that might be, and ensuring that they're purchasing devices that we're sure about the manufacture of? Is it something that's manufactured in China? Do we have to worry about backdoors that are intrinsic to the core components, the CPUs, things of that nature, right? So, and are the components that we're buying, are they going to be readily available? Are we going to have maintenance contracts, replacement contracts, and be able to have that? So these things from a procurement perspective, before we even receive the hardware, a lot of times we're not thinking about that. That needs to be part of the decision-making process. And then development and maintenance, and ensuring that we have handling, and then also decommissioning of those devices in part of that product lifecycle. And then finally, at the bottom there, again, in account administration and access and authentication and authorization, are we using multi-factor authentication where we can, as I described before, those systems that are IT systems operating in an OT environment? It could be, how do you access the control system remotely? Because we're not going to every site and visiting every control panel and jacking in straight at that control panel. We'll probably have some sort of remote access. Are we doing that via secure channels of remote access, where we are in fact using multi-factor authentication to validate our identity to the system, that and then getting that secured and encrypted communication? So these are technical controls that we would want to look at. And as part of assessing that risk, right? And within ISA 62443, as we're going through that process, this is readily available at the ISA website. This is the primary risk flow, right? So the security risk assessment for design. And you can see how this walks us through as we are implementing our controls and reevaluating how are we protecting our assets. We can continue to go through here, and you can see there are loops where we can improve upon even initial controls that we set. So we start out, we take a look at the architecture, we identify what we have as the assets, we assess that, we evaluate the risk, maybe we revise the program. Is it a high risk component? Do we need to reassess? Do we have residual risk that we need to take a look at? And then once at that point in time, we understand that the criticality and categorization of our asset, its classification, we understand the controls that we have applied, whether it's physical access control, logical access control, secure remote access, encryption at rest, encryption in transit, and then we document, and then we may reassess, and we may loop back through, right? But we are certainly looking at what we need to do to constantly improve the safeguarding and the security posture, both physical and logical, for those environments. And then this is that process flow that can assist you through those steps. And the reason we want to do that is because we have to understand what are we getting out of the controls that we're putting in. And I think this is probably, if there's anything that I'll leave you with, as we're in the process developing a program to meet the NIS2 directives, is this is not only good for you, your organization, and within your vertical, and your recognized area, whether it's essential or important. But this is what you're going to take a look at to get you where you need to be. Because if you're just applying cybersecurity technical controls and you don't know why, then you could be overprescribed, where the too much or too little controls and mitigation of risk, or you're underprescribed, where it's not enough. So, how do we find that effective balance? And what we have to do is look at a risk capacity ledger or a scale, as you can see on the right side. Right. So at the bottom, we have no risk. That's where we just assume that there's no risk. And there's never going to be a lack of risk. So there's always some residual risk to anything that you can't account for. And then if we choose to not qualify for any risk, then that's just negligence. But in between, we've got the minimum, low, medium, high, and maximum. And what we need to do is figure out what is the risk acceptance or risk tolerance level for the organization, what we do, our adherence to NIS2, and then where do we find our risk tolerance, our risk acceptance, and then we apply controls and best practices to figure out our risk treatment, and we will be able to dial in our risk tolerance level to our risk acceptance. And then each individual control, whether it's technical, organizational, or procedural, that we apply to the OT environment, the process control environment, and our personnel, we are reducing incrementally that risk over time. And then that's why we reevaluate on at least an annual basis to understand if our risk treatments or our controls, whether they're technical or otherwise, are they still relevant? Like an endpoint protection software that you're using today may not be relevant in a couple of years, and you'll have to reassess, realign, and you may have to upgrade or move to a different product or a different platform. There could be firewalls that have certain capabilities that may not be relevant or necessary in the future years to come, and we have to have elevated capabilities. So when we buy something or we make an investment in a technical control, we have to always continually reassess if it's relevant to the risks that we're trying to mitigate, and then that's that part of that delicate balance. So as we work through, we evaluate the risks, we assign the best practices and controls, and then we're reviewing. And again, at the bottom there, we can see the goal is to reduce the likelihood of threats, right? So, and then we're always taking a look at the threat vectors and what that may represent. And so let's kind of take a look at what this looks like if I'm going to have risk mitigation and treatment, and what does that look like in terms of, and this is a very simplified architecture here in order to have the discussion, right? So identity and control, how am I able to identify personnel and operators within the environment? What are they connecting via? Do they have, is it wireless and a mobile? Is it a workstation? It could be an engineering workstation, but where do they exist? Do they exist in a isolated zone? Is everyone on the same network? Have we instituted isolation and segmentation? That's what we want to get to. And that's where we want to, especially for NIS2 requirements, we want to be able to safeguard those environments from possible threat, right? And so then we have these network layers, the concepts of network layers, and then we get to the business firewall. Maybe we have DMZs, but then downstream of that, how am I isolating and segmenting my OT environment from my IT? Right, so I could have a SCADA system, but then it may have another firewall or pass it back through the firewall on the accepted protocols and controls to the PLC, the RTU, HMI, and most importantly, like the safety instrumented systems. So, uptime and availability. So where we're looking at NIS2, and NIS2 wants to ensure the safeguarding of critical operations in essential and important entities. But part of that, if we drill down, and what it doesn't take into account is, what does that mean for OT? Well, I can have my process control environment that's for my production systems. That's great. Is my safety instrumented system also part of that same collection of PLCs? That should be separate. We want the safety instrumented system to operate separately of our process control system, so that if the process control system is impacted, the safety instrumented system is also isolated and segmented from the rest of that environment, so it has the ability to warn, notify, and alert the human counterparts that may be within that process control environment, especially if it's energy like gas, oil, nuclear, chemical manufacturing, where we have to get the human element out of that environment before there's any risk to human safety or loss of life. So we take a look at how we enhance and tailor the OT security, understanding that the NIS2 directives are quite clear on the deployment of technical controls, isolation, segmentation, networking, encryption, multi-factor authentication. But it's how do we take these things and apply those in our process control environments? And I think it has to be more of a layered defense. And if we were to use the Purdue Enterprise Reference Architecture, and I do understand, it should be noted, the Purdue Enterprise Reference Architecture is based on time, first and foremost. So as you work your way up from level 0, 1, level 2, level 3, time is the critical factor. Latency within the control system is the critical factor. But as we've seen over the last 5, 6 years, similar to the OSI layers and networking, IT people and IT folks have a better and easier time if we incorrectly use the Purdue Enterprise Reference Architecture to show levels and then assign networking and isolation and segmentation and the categorization or the zones and conduits to that. It may be incorrect, but it is functional, right? And the ISA 99 working group, they mentioned that in ISA 62443, where they do use the Purdue Enterprise Reference Architecture to bring into the concept of zones and conduits in between the levels as we work up through the stack. So we see here we have our field devices that are at level 0, 1. And we're really not doing anything there, only because the field bus, it's not going to lend itself to the network side of things. We do want to ensure that we are watching the sensor data and the sensor information in our field deployed devices. But as we start working up into the process control level, that's where we introduce the network. And the threat vectors for the network side of OT have historically been the enterprise IT, and we'll get to where we isolate and segment from that. But we also want to understand that anything introduced into the process environment, maybe from an engineering workstation, if we have the unauthorized insertion of a USB component into an engineering workstation, we want to be cognizant of that. We want to have technical controls that are always safeguarding maybe the endpoint protection of a Windows-based engineering workstation, let's say. And then we would have a firewall element, or at least the concept of isolation segmentation, not only the network, but also the protocols that are needed at a least privilege level, and then into the supervisory and data acquisition or supervisory level. Okay, that's where we're going to have SCADA, data historian, maybe some engineering components, maybe very specific process control environment applications. And then at that point, if we need to get any data out of those environments and into the business, then that's where I have another firewall. And as I had mentioned before, we are probably implementing data diodes and unidirectional diodes to get that information out, but not allow anything to come in from the enterprise or the internet at level 5. So we want clear and distinct boundaries, level 4 and 5 down to level 3 and level 2. And then that will allow us from again, with the backdrop of the NIS2 directives, if we can get to this level where we've done an asset review, we understand our locations, our personnel, and our components, and if we're able to do a risk assessment and then figure out what is it that we need to apply as the technical, procedural, or organizational controls to reduce our risks. This is where our cybersecurity output comes into play. We document, we manage, and then we implement it within these categories and within these levels. You will be very close in a phased approach to the end result of a clear and functioning program that you can then improve upon as you continue to evaluate and reevaluate those people, process, and technology that you have within your control system or distributed control system or process environments. Monitoring and response and incident handling. So here we have incident response and then business continuity plans. And again, we have the same concepts in ISA 62443. There's a lot of incident response capability and direction that's out there on the internet. And I think what I want to do is take a look at what monitoring and detection gives us ahead of and after an incident, because I think these are very important. So a lot of times we're just collecting information. It could be SIM, it could be central logging, but who's minding the store? And are we really watching all of the notifications and alerts that are coming in from our control system environments, whether it's at a network, it could be a component and PLC level, could be at a SCADA level. But what we first want to do is proactively, we want to have threat prevention objectives in place, and we want to have visibility to our production environments, right? We want to avoid loss of power, obviously, loss of view, and loss of control. And what we want to do is be preventative on that. And we want to have alerts and notifications to the appropriate personnel. So process owners, it could be our IT counterparts, and in certainly engineering. And then how do we engage our incident response? As we see north of the cyber event, we're looking at reducing the probability of a compromise or an impact to our environment. So if we've done our asset categorization classification, if we've taken a look at our risks and we've implemented our controls and we're actively monitoring our systems, then what we're looking to do is we're reducing the probability that something might happen. But unfortunately, we're not going to be 100% effective every minute of every day, right? So when a cyber event does happen, the thing that we need to realize is if we have all of these practices and methodologies in place and we're doing this effectively, well, we're going to reduce the severity or the impact, right? So if we have operating system and control system logging, if we have the infrastructure and the firewalls in place, if we have centralized logging authority, if we have correlation of those systems, if we're able to get information to the incident response teams, and under Article 10 and 11 within the NIS2 directive, it does identify the computer security incident response team formation, what the capacities are, what the requirements are, what the expectations are. So the CCERT teams will need to follow or be assembled within the construct of what Articles 10 and 11 within the NIS2 directive state. But if we have our controls in place and we're bringing in this information, then what we have the opportunity to do is reduce the severity of the impact. So maybe we're able to quickly contain a compromise or an intrusion or an incursion. Maybe we're able to, through data loss prevention, we're able to stop the exfiltration of information. And on the OT system, that might be intellectual property in terms of how something's manufactured. If they can get to a bill of materials or ladder logic, or that kind of information, because a lot of times the sensitive and confidentiality is more on the enterprise IT side, but there are areas of intellectual property market advantage that we're doing inside our manufacturing operations. But when we talk about energy and water and safety of surrounding communities, especially if it's nuclear, chemical manufacturing, oil and gas, what does an explosion or an event represents to the surrounding community? It's our ability to reduce the severity impact of those events. If an incursion occurs, can we quickly contain and can we quickly respond? And then when we take a look at what that response looks like, and there are the requirements within the NIS2 directive. So we have is once an incident takes place, and a significant incident is a severe operational disruption, financial or otherwise, to the entity, whether it's essential or important. Within the first 24 hours, you have a CCERT involvement, perhaps involving local authorities, regional authorities, and then whether it's suspected to be caused by an unlawful or malicious act, first and foremost. right? So it's the first 24 hours. These are the requirements. So make sure that your incident response plans are tailored to the requirements at NIS2 if you are an essential or important entity or part of the supply chain that's identified within the NIS2 directive. And then within that 72 hours, so there's updates on the previous information and the indications of initial assessment, right? And then you're also including any additional severity or impact and the indicators of compromise. So we're starting at this point within that 72 hours. We're continuing to work towards mitigation of the event, return back to business operations or normal operations, but we also want to understand root cause. How did this first happen, and what information can we garner from that? And then finally, within the first month, it's having a detailed description. We've probably figured out what our root cause is. We either applied the mitigation or we have ongoing continual mitigation. Maybe there's bits and pieces that we're still rebuilding or pulling back together. And if it is still ongoing, then there has to be a progress report to the incident itself and everything that has taken place within that first month period and any ongoing months, depending on how long it takes to put the organization back into a production operation operating level. So finally, if we have readiness checklist, as we've talked about here, as we're putting together this phased approach, as we're looking at the NIS2 directives, as we want to achieve that adherence, because we don't want the penalties, again, 10 million euros or 2% of your turnover annually. You don't want any part of that, right? Identify organization. Are you essential? Are you important? Or are you part of that supply chain? And then it's do you have governance and policies? Is the documentation in place? Do you know what your assets are? Do you know what your physical environment and for your process control systems are? Have you taken a look at all of those assets, whether they're people, locations, components, network devices, OT devices, doesn't matter. Do you have a good handle on that? Have we been able to train and properly educate? And it could be IT operatives that are going to be assisting our process owners and our process operators in the OT space, or assisting engineering. And then have we been able to successfully apply risk and risk mitigation treatment to be able to get to, as I had said at the top, risk assessment against our assets first, cybersecurity is the output, the controls that we're putting in place to mitigate the risks. And at the end of that, because bad things happen to good people, and we can't be 100% all the time, are our monitoring, detection, and our incident response practices, are these geared towards the NIS2 directives, in addition to safeguarding our control systems and being able to allow us to reduce the impact of an event and then get back to production operations and safe operations in the shortest amount of time. And at the same time, as we were talking before, within that 24, 72, and that 1 month period, do our incident response plans allow for the documentation and the collection so that we can have root cause analysis, lessons learned, and then share that information with the upstream EU authorities within that NIS2 directive, because there are articles for information sharing so that others might benefit from what we learned if we had to endure or go through a cyber event. There you go. 1 hour, 1 minute. that's a lot to get through, Puneet.
Yeah, that was a great session. I suppose it is the time for the Q&A.
Nate Wheeler has a question.
All right. So yeah, so let's complete the questions on the Q&A, and we'll see if anyone has. Yeah. All right. So So Aman is asking, is NIS2 applicable for vehicle manufacture in India but selling in European region?
Right. So it's you have to take a look at if you're providing services to an organization, right, that is operating under. Now, the idea would be you might have to find that out. Preferably, the organization knows that they're an EU, either an essential or an important entity, and they would be doing the investigation. But sometimes we may have to be more proactive and ask an upstream, like our client, like we're doing manufacturing, the client is in the EU. We're certainly part of that supply chain, but we're in India. We may have to be proactive and ask, hey, client, have you taken a look at the NIS2 directive? Is the member state that you're operating in, going to have, as of October 17, 2024, there's these requirements. Are you aware of this? Do you have expectations of us? Now, a lot of times, if I was sitting in that seat, I would say, well, isn't it their responsibility to understand that? But we can be proactive and maybe make the inquiry and at least get a little bit ahead of the curve or ahead in the process steps, because it would allow us to understand as a supplier, a manufacturing supplier in a manufacturing supply chain for a client that's in the EU. I'd probably rather want to know that or get an idea ahead of time rather than maybe wait. And if you have a client that maybe isn't taking NIS2 seriously, then what you could end up with is where they call you in a panic and say that you have to be ready for this because they have to be ready for it. And then we're doing things very rapidly, and that's where mistakes can be made. So I think the best thing would be is if you're part of a supply chain and you have a client that you're doing like in the case manufacturing, so important entity, and you're part of that supply chain, I think it would be best to be proactive and make an inquiry if the client is aware of the NIS2 directives and if they need, our organization downstream to play a part in that.
All right. So Victor comments on with a clarification. So I would correct the presenter that notification timer starts at the moment when entity has assessed incident severity and confirmed it as significant one based on criteria of Article 23.
Yeah, so if we see here we go. So the occurrence of the significant incident or the cyber event. So it's at that time that it starts. Now, it's when in a lot of frameworks or guidance, I know in the like in the US. So if you're a Department of Defense manufacturer and there's the new or the soon to be in 2025, the CMMC requirements under a DFARS contract, and they have the concept of reporting incidences. The incident reporting is at the time that it's discovered, right? So you could have, like, let's say, John, there's an incursion into the network, and it's a number of days until it's identified. It's not when you determine that it occurred. It's when you know that the incursion is actively taking place. So the significant incident is when the organization becomes aware of it, right? So at that time, and then that kicks off the process. In the first 24 hours, you're starting you have your incident response team assembled, and they're responding to the incident or the event in the manner that is appropriate. So if it's a high severity or low severity, you're handling it appropriately. But it's at the time that the discovery of the event takes place, and you're beginning your initial triage in your investigation of what is actually occurring or what the impact might be. Because you first have to assess, is this even a significant event? If it's a low severity event that isn't causing a severe operational disruption or financial impact, then it might not be something that warrants or meets the level or criteria of reporting to the upstream EU authorities. Hopefully that answers the question.
All right. So Harshal Sharma is asking, how does NIS2 compliance is evaluated? Are there a set of requirements that can be used for gap analysis in order to verify compliance level?
Right. So again, kind of as we talked at the top, and I'll get back to that initial slide. So these are the directives, and if you read through the documentation on the NIS2, it's very high level. They talk about measures and measurable components. This is why when I was looking over this last week, is that how do I give folks something that is a foundation, right? And that's where I had arrived at the conclusion that we can use ISA 62443 to give us a foundation. And then we can take those controls and those risk mitigation efforts, and then we can assign to some degree, you're going to have your own key performance indicators of the successful implementation of your own controls. It's you can read through the NIS2 directive in terms of what the expectations are and the implementation, but they don't really get specific in terms of what's a performance indicator that we're doing something correctly. It's that they want you to achieve adherence to the security or implementation of secure infrastructure, multi-factor authentication, policies and procedures on encryption at rest, encryption in transit. They're asking that these things be done, and it's very basic in terms of the language. So I think what we're going to have to do as practitioners and security administrators in OT environments is best effort. And you may, for a period of time, until, as we saw, a revision of the directive, maybe in 2027, as they go live with NIS2 and receive information back, we may find better key performance indicators that we can use. But that's why I thought it was probably more beneficial to set a standard such as ISA 62443, where we do have the capability of measuring our own success, because we're not really finding a lot of that specific directive within the language of the NIS2. And I think it's difficult because you have a directive that needs to be able to be malleable to like 80% of the marketplace in these verticals and the essential and the important entities. And that's a difficult balance. So hopefully that answers that question.
All right. Yeah. I think there was one more question, but I think you have answered the same thing. All
Okay.
right. So yeah. So Victor is asking why the critical entities resilience directive has not been mentioned.
The what? The
Critical entities resilience directive, CER.
let's see here. The so the critical okay. Well, so what we for this session, it was looking at the important and because I wanted to get to the essential and important. And if you take a look at for the critical, hold on a second, I'm going to pop into this segment. So areas of high criticality and importance. So if we have, and if I'm understanding correctly, it's a category beyond essential and important. Is that what we're looking at from a question perspective, John?
I'm not sure, but we can share the link.
I'm going to do is have a question. There was one on the
Yeah,
DMZ slide.
I suppose it is talking about the critical infrastructure related thing, but maybe I'll put it in the chat. It
Right. If you
opens up
put
a
pop the
yeah.
question in the chat and I can take a look at it, because it's just I want to make sure I have the wording critical entities resilience directive.
The question was why the critical entities resilience directive CER has not been mentioned.
Well, I mean, we're looking at the NIS2, right? And then so critical entities under NIS2 are, and on the screen I'm sharing, this is what's identified, whether Annex 1 and Annex 2, and these are the critical entities for NIS2, and then we're taking a look at these and applying those, and then where they have OT operations and process control environments is what would be the game plan or a phased approach for that. So I don't know that. I mean, we could certainly, and of course, within the presentation and having an hour to go through it, it would probably expand the scope of what we're talking about. But what we wanted to do was make sure for the attendees and for the session itself is that we focused in on the high critical importance for the essential and the important entities, and then breaking out, as we did in a few of these, where these apply to, specifically energy, water, transport, and then manufacturing. So probably not a great answer, but I think it was more about scope of the presentation overall, and then what that means.
All right. So I think we are okay. There's one more question before we can switch on to direct questions by the few of the participants. So Rahul is asking, is it possible that IT and OT are not connected? If not connected, then OT is exposed to any risk?
That's a good question. So if we're talking about air gapping. So if I take a process control system and I separate it entirely, as we do, I mean, like 20 years ago, I mean, that was standard operating procedure. You had a process control environment, let's say at a water wastewater facility, and the IT systems, largely even the like the IT security people or the IT administrators didn't even know that was there. It was probably, designed, built, and deployed by an engineering service partner, and it was just some project that they had heard about. It is reasonable to assume that there's not a significant amount of risk, because IT is always traditionally the threat vector about 90% of the time, but you can avoid all risk. So as we were talking, physical environment, inadvertent mistakes, right? So do we have standard operating procedures so that even a new junior member of the team that has to fill in for an engineer that may be sick that day, and do they understand how they're supposed to operate? So I could have a disconnected environment in a control panel, and if I have an uneducated process operator who isn't quite sure about what they're doing, do they have the potential to negatively impact the environment? Yeah, we could have loss of power, loss of view. Maybe they pull a cable, bump a cable. I can't remove all risk, but if I have a disconnected process control system that has no connectivity to anything else beyond just the local network itself, then I am reducing a significant amount of risk. So the answer is yes, and then no. Yes, I reduce a significant amount of risk, but no, I can't reduce all physical risk or the risk of personnel, uneducated. And that's why cybersecurity and awareness of training and training personnel is also very key. Daniel, there he is. Is that Mr. Ehrenreich?
All right. So I think we will start with Nate Wheeler.
He's on mute, I think.
Okay. I think it should be.
Yeah, he's there. Nate, your turn. You're unmuted.
Okay. Yeah, looks so.
Okay. Next person.
Oh, audio issues.
Okay. While we wait for Nate to connect, there is one more question regarding Harshal is asking. Recently, Cyber Resiliency Act has been introduced in EU. How is NIS2 different than CRA?
I think this is. Oh, yeah. Okay, Nate. I think we're going to find that, and we kind of talked about this at the top, is the NIS2 directives, because they're very high level, and then you have the cyber resiliency. So that's come out, and even here in the U.S., we have significant efforts from CISA, as well as other. There's constantly new directives coming out, whether it's the U.S., the EU. I know that Australia, from a process controls environment and directives, has done a significant amount in creating policy, even for themselves, and in a lot of cases is leading the charge. Are these different? How are they different? I think to answer the question is that they're largely very similar. I mean, if I took directives from the EU, from Australia, from the US, and stacked those up, they're 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 probably 80% matched up with each other, because there's only so many ways, so many directives that I can have, and we're not doing anything very differently. And with the number of, I think in the last year, there's probably been a handful of events that were significant enough to hit like global media and news. But it always seems to be the same. And most recently, it's always ransomware that eventually bleeds over and impacts the OT environment. There aren't many direct attacks against OT environments specifically. It's always a threat vector from the IT side, the enterprise IT. I would say that if you're looking at the Cyber Resilience Directive, NIS2, and any other directives that are coming out within any regions or countries, they're going to be very similar. So, the question was, how are they different? I would flip that around, and what I would do is say they're very similar. And if I'm solving for one, and if I'm doing a mapping table, I'm probably meeting the objective of others if I'm just doing the basics, right? So asset management, categorization of assets, applying technical security like isolation, segmentation, firewalls, network security, physical access security, least privilege of accounts. So I'm not, not everyone's an administrator on the network, reducing the protocols to and from source and destination, and then secure remote access. And then most importantly, have I vetted and have I reviewed my third-party suppliers, especially engineering organizations that are responsible for the design, build, and deployment, management, and maintenance of my process control environments. If you're doing those things, you're probably going to meet, whether you're in the US, the EU, India, or Australia, you're probably going to meet 80 to 85% of the requirements of any of the directives or policy that is being made by nations or regions throughout the world. As we encounter, I get a question, especially in the U.S. Organizations will say, should I look at NIST CSF? Should I look at CMMC? Should I look at SOC 2? Should I look at high trust? Should I look at ISO 27001? These things all have about 80% overlap because they're all looking to achieve the same safeguarding and risk mitigation, whether it's IT systems or OT systems. Hopefully that answers that question. It's probably kind of a high level answer, but it's, and I understand what people, Manufacturing organizations within the U.S. encounter these issues a lot, where they have to they'll have clients. Some clients that are looking for a SOC 2. If they're international, they'll be required to have an ISO 27001. So they're managing a lot of different frameworks and requirements contractually or from a regulatory position. And so what they'll do is, a lot of times there's platforms out there where you can load in different frameworks, and then wherever the overlaps are, if I solve for one with evidence, artifacts, configuration, and deployment, it meets the requirements of another. But competing directives and policy happens more often than not. All right. Who did we have next?
All right. So next, Olubawale. Olu, are you still available online? If not,
yes, I am. Yes, I am. Thank you very much.
Yeah, go ahead.
Excellent presentation, Paul.
Thank you, Olu. Thank you.
I think it's probably not concerning the NIS, but when you look at the OT strategy, design and implementation, etc. My question is around zero trust.
Okay.
So I noticed a lot of people just talk about zero trust. For me, zero trust is not. It's a business. It's a selling business model. How is that achievable? I mean, yes, you can have zero trust or the mindset of having zero trust.
That's it.
But
right there.
Zero trust cannot be achieved 100%. You have to, your segregation, your network, your people, process, technology, proceed, So why do a lot of people just use and hammer on zero trust? Because I just think it's a business selling gimmick. I mean, to me.
So that was a great. You actually you did most of my work for me, Alu. So zero trust started 2011. John Kindervag and Forrester came out with the concept of zero trust, and that concept started out with 3 principles. And I think the United States federal government recognizes now 5, not principles, but pillars of zero trust. And Alu, as you said, these are concepts. There's no like, and when we see, who is it? Zscaler says it's your zero trust remote access. What does that mean? So everyone sticks now, and even I put into, I used it on this particular slide on the share, least privilege, but it's the principles of zero trust. It's the idea that, am I implementing technical controls where I am not trusting the account identifier or the authentication and validation of an account until it's cleared a password or a multi-factor authentication? Do I know what that device is? Do I know who that person is? Do I know what's on my network or what's connecting to my network? These are the concepts of zero trust. That's an architecture. It's a concept architecture where I'm able to implement, and it could be very simple things,
Exactly.
So it could be, like zero trust on a control panel is the control panel always locked, and are the keys of the control panel kept in the plant the plant office, and do they have to be checked out and then checked back in after you're done working on the control panel? If so, I am not trusting anyone to walk up to that open control panel and open it up and do whatever they want. But I didn't have to go get a zero trust lock,
Exactly.
But I think that's what people miss. We see that a lot. There's a lot of marketing, especially as all of you attending. I really appreciate everybody this hour and a half. But as all of you can attest, there is a inordinate and extraordinary amount of marketing wrapped around concepts that doesn't even help us. In fact, our last presentation last month was OT security when the cure is worse than the disease. And we're literally looking at fear, uncertainty, and doubt in marketing. and how it relates to OT security, and it is not helping. And the idea that there's all this, Alu, you were right. There's all this zero, you have to do all this zero trust. And I would look at somebody trying to sell me that and say, how is that applicable? It's almost like, like I said, I wouldn't secure a control panel with a zero trust lock. I would simply get a lock, and I'd have a process, and I'd have a procedure for people to get the key to unlock and access the control panel, and then return the key and check it back in. That is process and a procedural control.
I couldn't agree with you any better. Yeah. So I just think that that word zero trust should be, yeah, less privilege, etc. And they don't try and sell you something, because once I ask this question, they start going roundabout, and saying things, and I'm like, no, it's not.
Correct.
Thank you.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right. So next we have
Is it Julian and then Daniel?
Julian. Junior,
Hi, Paul.
you can.
Hey.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation and discussion about
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I have a question. So I saw in one of the slides that the internet is inside the DMZ.
Yeah.
So So my question is it okay to have an internet access in the IT and OT DMZ, or internet should always be coming from the level 4 or level 5?
So in this, because there's not a lot of room on the slide, so it's a very good question. So I tried to get everything on the slide, but not make everything so small that it wouldn't be legible, right? So the idea here is that there's this the business firewall may have segmentation of different networks. So I could have my internet. It could be a series of connections or a series of networks, especially now, Julian, when we see software-defined networking, we're starting to blur the line in between what is my actual connectivity to the outside world via the internet, and then I may have a DMZ that's off to the side. So it's a great question. I do want to let everyone know that that I just had that kind of in a DMZ space, because the next slide is that Purdue Enterprise Reference Architecture. And what this was kind of doing, and I should have been more specific here, is it's the idea that there's that 3.5, the ICS DMZ, right? Or this space between enterprise, internet, and then other connections outside the firewall that may be that DMZ. Absolutely great question. It was trying to fit everything on that slide in that space. But you could have a firewall could have a number of different connections beyond just the protected networks south of the firewall. So I could have internet, software-defined network. I could have hard connections to a data center, dark fiber, something like that, or the DMZ, right? So, but it's every organization is going to be different. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, got it. Yeah. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Paul.
All right. Next, I think it's Daniel.
Daniel's on mute. Hopefully he's still there. Well, Daniel, are you there? You're on mute. If you are.
All right. So while we wait for Daniel, maybe we can go with the next person.
JJ.
JJ,
Hey,
go
Paul.
ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really good.
Thank
So,
you.
Question from my end would be this. So at level 0 and at level 1, there
Yeah.
could be multiple components that are, say, phased out or no longer supported by suppliers. And right now, if you take a look in the market, there are control systems that's running from 80s, 90s, and even older.
Yep.
So there was this debate within my teams, and I am of the opinion that if keep this layer segregated or under a next generation firewall, whatever it is, it should do the needful. What would you say from a NIS2 perspective? Is this enough, or does it check the bare minimum? Or what should be an alternative strategy here?
So just to parrot that back, make sure I've got it right.
Mm-hmm.
So for the field devices, there's downstream suppliers that are providing those capabilities, correct? Okay.
Mhm.
And then what you're stating is that we would introduce a next generation firewall between ourselves and those suppliers and that 0-1 capacity or capability, correct?
Mhm.
Okay. Are you responsible for the control that is happening between 0-1 and, let's say, the process of control 2? Or is somebody else handling that? And let me be a little bit more because if I've separated the field devices from the process control, but I'm
Mhm.
responsible for the process control, but a supplier is responsible for the actual, let's say the physical that's taking place in the field. One, I believe that the isolation segmentation and only allowing the required traffic, right? So in a next generation firewall, if I've got network communication between the process control at level 2 and the field devices that are distributed through to suppliers in, let's say, manufacturing operations, if I'm allowing that communication to occur and I know the source and the destination, and I can in least privilege reduce the the communication only for the required functionality, then I'm meeting the NIS2 directives. The thing that you want to proceed with caution on is that in meeting those directives and those requirements for security, safeguarding of the communication, the network security, am I putting at risk the am I at risk of loss of control or loss of view because we do have a separation between two entities, you and the supplier, for the cyber physical or the actual physical process that's taking place with your supplier? And are you responsible for the process control? Like, do you own the PLC and then they own the device, or is it a master PLC and a downstream PLC that's taking place? I think it'd be, and this is where when we talk about discovery and we talk about scope and assets, we may have a distributed control system between ourselves and a supplier that goes beyond, meeting the directives. Yes, we can meet the directives by implementing a firewall and having the control of the protocols and not allowing anything to traverse to us from the supplier that is not specifically necessary for production operations. But then I have to take a look at the scope and safeguarding my uptime, my safety, and my reliability of the system. Am I able to do that if I've separated a degree of the control on either side? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So, for example, to take example of a downstream PLC.
Yep.
So, say supplier one is no longer out of service, is no longer in the picture. They've
Okay.
been bankrupt, say 5 years ago. Supplier two is no longer in relationships with us.
Okay.
And what would be a strategy here? So these would be at the very low, so level 0 and level 1. What would be a suitable strategy here in case if we cannot slap on a firewall? Because sometimes you have certain protocols that have latency requirements, etc. So what could be a strategy here? Because right now, let's say we have like 80% in the fleet that that are using these components. What could
Okay.
be a way to mitigate this?
depending on the flow of traffic and what's controlling what, that's where you might institute for, if a firewall is going to institute too much latency, then what I might do is make use of a data diode or unidirectional communication, right? So I increase my, I can remove a slight degree of latency, but I still need to ensure that that the supplier isn't a threat vector. So we saw that, so there have been a couple of incidences, whether in 2023 or 2024, where third parties are the threat vector, and you're only as good as the security of the downstream supplier. And sometimes that's not very effective, or they're not practicing any sound security at all. And so as a threat actor, if I know, and we know this is taking place, threat actors are taking a look at supply chain, and they're looking for weaker links to be able to use that as a vector into what their ultimate target is. And that ultimate target might be yourself. And if they're coming through on a supplier side, then how safe and secure is the supplier? So I think it's either you have to have it completely cut off, or you have to have some measure of capability in that space, in the communications between yourself and your downstream suppliers. But something has to be there. And I understand that a firewall can introduce latency, especially if there's encryption. But then we need to take a look at other risk mitigation and controls that we can introduce. If it is getting data out or getting data in, then maybe a data diode is able to do that more effectively. But I think you're on the right path, that you want some sort of barrier there that you can control as a point of monitoring, as a choke point, and as a point of access and authorization. And as Olu is talking about, that's really a principle of zero trust. It's not a zero trust firewall, but it's a principle of zero trust. Am I going to trust intrinsically and empirically that downstream supplier? Probably not. What I need to do is figure out what is the balance of the risk that it presents. You may find if you talk to leadership, and I'll close with this, and we'll get on to some of the other questions. What you may do is a risk assessment and say, okay, let's not put anything in, and let's have them connected to our control system. What is the risk? Is it high? Is it severe? Or is it low? And is the organization willing to accept that risk? So make it a risk-based conversation. And then if the risk is too high, then you implement the firewall, understanding that I'm also introducing a risk of latency, but the risk of latency is lower than the risk of threat and a threat vector from a supplier. And so you have a risk-based conversation, and the organization will choose to have the risk of latency versus the risk of compromise.
That's exactly the answer I am looking for.
I should have just started there.
No, but yeah, thank you for debriefing it and taking your time. Thank you, Paul.
Yep. We have Daniel next.
Yeah, Daniel, you can go ahead.
Oh. Be on mute.
She's already unmuted. I'm not sure what happened.
Daniel, you're on mute. If you can hear us. Oh, looks like he's trying.
Yeah, it's already. Anyway, not sure what is wrong, but maybe you can go ahead with Victras. Victras, please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Loud and clear.
All right, so it's a little bit of challenge working out of Mac. So yeah, being a NIS2 lead implementer, I have the question more to the comparison of NIS2 and US legislation. Okay. So in March this year, there was a comparison done by the DHS and the EU Commission trying to harmonize the legislation. Do you see any movement in the US that US will start expanding the scope or bringing something on the federal level similar to NIS2?
In fact, I was having this conversation. It's a great question. Thank you, Victor. So I was having this conversation with several colleagues. I think it was 2 weeks ago, and it had come up. What we are seeing from a policy level is within the U.S. You have multiple agencies that are at the top of the federal administration. So you have the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, the FCC, the FTC. And in fact, I don't know if anyone reads. I recently participated. It was last Sunday. Anna Rivera at Industrial Cyber had released an article, and it was all about policy and cybersecurity under CISA here in the States, and in lieu of Cybersecurity Month. And we talked about how within the federal government, it's not the federal government as a whole is not mandating across everybody. What they're doing is within agencies that are in charge of individual verticals, they are instituting tighter controls, and they're moving towards a lot of. Remember, we talked about different policy in different regions, whether it's EU, Australia, the US, is 80% is an overlap, right? Network isolation, monitoring, incident response, multi-factor authentication. What we are seeing is that within each vertical of these different agencies, whether it's DHS, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, they're all starting to get to this idea of reporting or securing networks, securing data, securing operations, and then incident reporting up. In fact, it was Executive Order 14028 that specifically in, I think it was 2022, that was specifically about information sharing of incidences, so that similar to even in the NIS2 directive, in getting information to upstream EU authorities through your CCERT teams, is that information sharing and improving lessons learned throughout the U.S. So there's actually, and it's almost like the tortoise where it moves very slow, but we are seeing a match or a movement in the same steps as the NIS2 directive. It's just being handled on an agency by agency basis, and it's kind of being brought together through executive order by the White House administration, at least with Executive Order 14028. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you for the update. Just one comment. When the community of US, I'm working for US company actually, but I'm based in the other country, in the EU. So when from your knowledge, when the US is going to have the similar approach like NIS2 on the global level, not agency based? 5 years, 10 years, never.
Yeah, I would say we're probably looking at, man, that could be 10 years. Here's our problem. We can't get out of our own way, right? And the reason we can't get to a collective decision, and we have to do it by agency, and I'll go on the record saying this, is most of the agencies want to do their own thing, and they won't work collaboratively. Like if the Department of Defense figures something out, the Department of Energy doesn't say, hey, that's a good idea, I'll do that. The Department of Energy goes and does their own thing. They're similar, almost exact. Like the Department of Defense has CMMC, but the Department of Energy has C2M2. But they're nearly identical. So exactly. It could be, I would say, Victor, I would say it's either 10 years or never, unfortunately.
Yeah, just for the community here. So here you see there, NIS2 is very unique thing because 27 countries came to the common approach.
Yes.
Countries, not agencies.
Right.
So that's a beauty of NIS2. All right, thank you.
All right.
All right, Daniel, I think you're fine now. Maybe you can go ahead.
Yes, finally, after I restarted my the program, it's working, so no problem, all good. Thank you, Paul. Great presentation. It's always pleasure for me to be here with a really reading expert. I would like to comment. These sessions must be very educational because the people who are coming are really looking for understanding things. When we speak about the connection, should IT and OT be connected or converged? Many people already know my opinion
Yep.
about it. And to make it very, very clear, I would like just in a moment to repeat my statement. IT and OT networks must be separately designed, deployed, tested, and when everything is working fine separately, people can ask nicely a question: what are the reasons, business reasons, that we may need to connect between the network? It can be a manager who wants to see every minute the production. It can be many other reasons. So after we understand the reason, we can select. If we can put the data diode, obviously it's the best. If not, we can put a DMZ or we can put a junk host server. So different solutions, but remember, based on understanding of why are we doing the connection. We should not accept, IT and OT are blurring, who cares about the separation, who cares about the segregation. These are wrong statements. We need to ask why. So based on that, we should select a solution. When we speak about the firewall, Paul explained about the delays, about the problems. So I would like to say here two things. First of all, we rather not put any firewall into the OT zone. Why? Because every cyber defense mechanism in the OT zone may create operating risk to the system, physical risk. Okay, so if we speak about the firewall between the layer 3 and the upper layers, I don't think that the term latency is very important here. Why? Because the real-time process where latency is very, very critical happens at layer 0, 1, and 2. Layer 3 and above are kind of reporting. So we need to have a system designed in a way that latency must not impact the operation process. Remember, I'm coming from age where SCADA systems were built with 1200 bit per second analog radios. Okay, remember, that's my age, 1200 bits per second analog radios, and we designed the systems in a way that latency was not a problem, and also designed the system with the protocol that assured 100% data reliability. So these are the two things I think very important. No longer use the term convergence. We need to use the term secured IT-OT interfacing, and this term is already being discussed at the 62443 committee. So I think that we are on the way to do great things.
Great. I appreciate Daniel. It's always great to talk with you. Thank you very much. I think that was that's a perfect cap on the session as well, especially as we had some conversations about level 0, 1, level 2, and then how to meet the those NIS2 directives. So and then thank you for joining. It was great, Daniel. John, Puneet, I think are we looking to wrap up?
Yes, yeah, about time already.
All right.
All right. Thank you once again, everyone. I guess, yeah. Thanks for spending your Saturday evening with Paul and everyone of us from the OT security professionals. And thank you, Paul, once again for sharing your insights about NIS2 and answering our questions very patiently.
Yep. Thank you very much. It was great. Another great session. Thank you for the opportunity to present and take the. I love the questions. I love the dialogue. Like we always say. So last time it was like an hour, and now it was an hour and a half, and we ran over. We could literally go all day. So
Hope
thank
to
you,
have
everyone.
you and Daniel maybe one day in India soon.
Oh yeah.
Hopefully.
Yep.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So,
All
right,
right,
everybody.
Puneet, any last words?
Thank you so much. See you soon in
Yeah.
another session. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye bye. Have a good weekend.